The mighty crystal spires of the Grand Archive stretched toward the dying sun, their once brilliant surfaces now dulled by the weakening light. Inside, Ray moved through the corridors, his crystalline form casting weak rainbow patterns on the walls. Like all the brightness, his body was made of living crystal that absorbed and channeled light. But these days, there wasn't much light left to channel. The Archive's main chamber held the Council of Light's emergency meeting. Ray took his place among the other historians, their forms barely glowing in the dim light. The First Light, leader of their people, floated at the chamber center, her usual brilliant glow now just a soft shimmer. "Our star dies faster than we predicted," the First Light announced, her voice resonating through their crystal bodies. "The calculations are clear. We have less than 5 cycles remaining before the light becomes too weak to sustain our children." Murmurs of distress rippled through the gathered brightness. Ray watched as several of the younger ones flickered anxiously, their crystal forms showing signs of stress. They all knew what was happening. Their sun, the source of all life for the brightness, was entering its final stages far sooner than anyone had expected. "We've sent exploration teams to 17 different solar systems," continued the First Light. "None meet our specific requirements. The light from their stars is either too intense or too weak. Our biology is—" She paused, searching for the right words, unfortunately precise in its needs. Ray remembered the failed expeditions all too well. He had recorded each one in the archive, documenting how their people's unique crystal biology made finding a new home nearly impossible. The brightness needed exactly the right type of stellar radiation to survive. Too much would shatter their crystal forms, too little would leave them unable to maintain their consciousness. First Light's next words drew Ray's attention back to the present. "There is one sector we haven't explored. It was previously considered too primitive, but we can no longer afford to be selective. The Sol system." The chamber erupted in surprised flickers of light. Ray knew why. The Sol system had been ignored because it contained something the brightness had always avoided: organic life. Specifically, a civilization of beings called humans who didn't rely on direct stellar energy for survival. The very concept seemed bizarre to most of the brightness. "We've received strange energy readings from their planet," the First Light continued. "They appear to have mastered artificial light generation on a massive scale. While primitive compared to our crystalline technology, their methods might offer alternatives we haven't considered." Ray found himself becoming increasingly interested. As a historian, he had studied distant civilizations, but humans were particularly fascinating. They survived in what the brightness would consider near darkness, yet they had built cities that glowed brighter than some stars. The council debated through what remained of the day cycle. Ray recorded everything, noting how desperation was finally pushing his people toward options they would never have considered in brighter times. When the First Light finally called for a vote, the decision was unanimous. They would send an expedition to the Sol system. As the chamber emptied, Ray lingered, watching the sunset through the archive's crystal walls. The light was noticeably weaker than even a cycle ago. Young brightness were being born with barely enough energy to achieve consciousness, and the oldest were beginning to fade. Their civilization, which had lasted for countless cycles, was running out of time. But perhaps, Ray thought, watching the last rays of their dying sun scatter through his crystal form, this forced change might lead to something unexpected. Sometimes the darkest times could lead to the brightest discoveries. He had no way of knowing then just how right he would turn out to be, or how a species so different from his own would change everything his people thought they knew about survival, adaptation, and the true nature of light. The human space station looked nothing like the elegant crystal structures the brightness were used to. Ray watched it through the view screen of their ship, studying its blocky metal shape and the strange solar panels that stretched out like wings. After 3 months of careful observation, the council had finally approved direct contact. "Remember," the mission commander spoke, his crystal form pulsing with authority, "these humans are unpredictable. They fight wars, they alter their environment, and they seemed to thrive on chaos. We must be cautious. Ray nodded, though privately he had begun to question these assumptions. During their observation period, he had watched humans help each other after a minor station accident. They had seen them work together to fix problems, share food, and even celebrate something they called birthdays, with artificial lights and fire-topped food items. Their ship, cloaked in bent light, moved closer to the station. As the designated speaker, Ray felt his crystal structure vibrate with nervous energy. Everything depended on this moment. The commander activated their signal beacon, dropping their cloak. The effect on the station was immediate. Lights flashed, and they picked up a surge of radio communications. The humans had spotted them. "Attention, unknown vessel." A calm voice came through their receivers, speaking in English. "This is International Space Station Alpha. Please identify yourself." Ray stepped forward, activating the communication system they had prepared. "Greetings, International Space Station Alpha. We are the Brightness, a peaceful species seeking dialogue with humanity." He paused, then added, "We come seeking help." The silence that followed felt endless. Ray could feel the anxiety rippling through his fellow crew members' crystal forms. Then, something unexpected happened. The human voice returned, now sounding almost excited. "Welcome to Earth space, Brightness. We've been wondering when someone would finally drop by. Would you like to dock? We have coffee." The commander nearly cracked his surface in shock. This wasn't the fearful or aggressive response they had prepared for. Ray quickly responded before his superior could object. "We would be honored. However, we should warn you. Our biology is very different from yours." What followed was beyond anything the Brightness had expected. Instead of fear or suspicion, the humans showed intense curiosity. They cleared an entire section of their station for the meeting, setting up special lighting conditions when Ray explained their needs. The first face-to-face meeting was almost comical. The humans, wearing what they called space suits, stared in wonder at the crystalline forms of the Brightness. Meanwhile, Ray and his team tried to understand how these beings of water and carbon could possibly function. "You're basically living crystals?" asked Dr. Miller, the station's lead scientist, her voice full of fascination rather than fear. "And you photosynthesize light directly for energy. That's incredible." Ray explained their situation: their dying sun, their failed searches, their desperate need for help. He expected pity, maybe even dismissal. Instead, he got problem-solving. "So you need specific wavelengths of light to survive." Dr. Miller was already typing on her tablet. "We've been working with artificial light spectrums for decades. Growing food in space requires exact light conditions too. This is definitely something we can work with." The commander shifted uncomfortably. "Our entire civilization needs saving, not just a few individuals. We're talking about housing and feeding millions of crystal beings." Dr. Miller looked up from her tablet, her eyes bright with what Ray would learn to recognize as the typical human response to an impossible challenge. "Well, we've got plenty of space rocks floating around our system that aren't doing anything useful, and we're pretty good at building things in space." She grinned. "Give us a problem big enough to be interesting, and humans tend to get creative." Ray felt something he hadn't experienced since their sun began dying: hope. These strange, soft beings didn't see an impossible crisis. They saw a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to overcome. The commander was still radiating skepticism, but Ray knew they had just found exactly what their people needed. Not just a solution to their problem, but something even more valuable: allies who saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles. The next few weeks aboard the space station changed everything. Ray thought he knew about organic life. He watched in amazement as human scientists worked tirelessly to understand the Brightness's biology. Their methods were strange. They took notes on tablets instead of storing memories in crystal matrices, and they seemed to need frequent breaks for something called sleep. Yet their progress was remarkable. Dr. Miller had assembled a team of 20 scientists from different countries on Earth. They converted an entire section of the station into a research lab, filled with special lights and scanning equipment. Ray found their constant questions both exhausting and oddly refreshing. "So your crystal structure actually shifts to absorb different wavelengths of light?" asked Dr. Miller one day, adjusting her glasses as she studied the readings from their latest test. "That's amazing. It's like having built-in solar panels that can adapt to different stars." Ray shifted his form to demonstrate, spreading his crystal lattice wider to catch more of the artificial light they were testing. "Yes, but the adaptation takes time. That's why finding a new home has been so difficult. We need time to adjust to new light conditions." "Time we can give you," Dr. Miller said confidently. "But first, we need to understand exactly how your bodies process light energy." The experiments continued. Sometimes they were simple, exposing small crystal samples to different light wavelengths. Other times they were more complex, like the day they tested how quickly a young brightness could adapt to artificial light sources. What amazed Ray most was how humans learned from failure. When an experiment didn't work, instead of giving up, they became more determined. They would gather around their whiteboards, another strange human invention, drawing diagrams and arguing about different approaches. One morning, Ray entered the lab to find Dr. Miller and her team looking unusually excited. They had been up all night, again, despite Ray's warnings about human need for sleep, working on something new. "We think we've cracked it," Dr. Miller announced, her tired eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Look at this." She pointed to a complex diagram on her tablet. "Your crystal structure doesn't just absorb light, it stores it, like a battery. If we can create artificial light sources that match your sun's exact spectrum, we could survive anywhere," Ray finished, his crystal form glowing brighter with sudden understanding. The commander, who had been skeptical of human methods, began spending more time in the lab after that. He watched as the humans tested prototype after prototype of specialized light emitters. Each failure taught them something new, and each success brought them closer to a solution. "I don't understand," the commander said to Ray one day. "Their own species isn't in danger. Why do they work so hard to help us?" Ray had been wondering the same thing. He found his answer in the station's database, reading about human history, stories of how they had faced their own near-extinction events, ice ages, plagues, world wars, and survived through cooperation and innovation. Humans understood desperation, and more importantly, they understood hope. Dr. Miller summarized it best when Ray asked her directly. "Because we can," she said simply. "Because every time we solve a problem like this, we learn something new. Because maybe someday we'll need help too, and we hope others would do the same for us." By the end of the month, they had their first successful prototype, a light emitter that could perfectly match the spectrum of the brightness's dying sun. But it was what Dr. Miller said next that truly showed Ray how different humans were from anything they had expected. "This is just the beginning," she said, already sketching plans for larger versions of the emitter. "We're not just going to save your species, we're going to give you more options than you've ever had before. How do you feel about turning asteroids into crystal cities?" Ray looked at the human scientist, realizing that his people hadn't just found saviors, they had found visionaries who could imagine possibilities that had never occurred to the brightness. And somehow, they had the determination to make those possibilities real. The main conference room of the space station buzzed with an energy Ray had never experienced before. Holographic displays filled the air, showing detailed plans for what the humans called Project Crystal Haven. Representatives from major Earth nations sat around the table, while members of the brightness floated nearby, their forms casting rainbow patterns on the walls. Dr. Miller stood at the front of the room, pointing to a three-dimensional map of the asteroid belt. "The math works," she said confidently. "We can convert the larger asteroids into habitable spaces for the brightness. Each one will be powered by a network of our new light emitters." The commander of the brightness shifted uneasily. "You're talking about hollowing out space rocks and turning them into artificial worlds. This has never been done before." "Exactly," Dr. Miller's eyes sparkled with excitement. That's what makes it perfect. Look at these calculations. She zoomed in on one asteroid model. We can use the natural minerals in the asteroids to create crystal-growing chambers. The outer shell will protect against radiation, and we can install the light emitters in patterns that mimic your homeworld's daily cycles. Ray watched as human engineers explained their plans. They would start with 3 medium-sized asteroids as a proof of concept. Each would be carved out using automated mining machines, then fitted with life support systems and the special light networks. The inner walls would be seeded with crystal-growing solutions, allowing the brightness to expand their living spaces naturally, just as they had done on their home world. But the cost, one of the Earth representatives began, is less than letting an entire civilization die. Another human finished firmly. Besides, think of what we'll learn. The technology we developed for this project could help us build sustainable colonies across the solar system. The commander turned to Ray, his crystal form pulsing with concern. Our Council of Light will never agree to this. Living in artificial habitats, using manufactured light. It goes against everything we've believed about proper existence. Ray was about to respond when an urgent message came through from their home world. The latest readings showed their sun's deterioration was accelerating. They had even less time than they'd thought. The room fell silent as Ray shared the news. Then, something remarkable happened. Instead of backing away from the challenge, the humans became even more determined. We'll work faster, Dr. Miller declared. We already have the prototype light emitters. We can begin converting the first asteroid immediately while we refine the plans for the others. But we've never done anything like this at such speed, an engineer protested. Then it's a good thing humans work best under pressure, Dr. Miller replied with a confident smile. Besides, we've got something better than time. We've got motivation and caffeine. Ray had learned enough about humans to understand the joke, but he was more interested in their determination. These beings, who had no stake in his species' survival, were willing to attempt the impossible simply because they refused to accept failure as an option. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Engineers began reprogramming mining robots while scientists finalized the designs for the crystal-growing chambers. Launch schedules were reorganized to prioritize getting equipment to the asteroid belt. I still don't understand, the commander said to Ray as they watched the humans work. How can they be so confident about something that's never been done before? Ray had been studying human history during his time on the station. Because that's what they do, he answered. Look at their history. The first time they flew. The first time they went to space. The first time they built this station. Everything was impossible until they did it. As if to prove his point, Dr. Miller walked up with another set of plans. We've figured out how to speed up the excavation process by 40%, she said. And we've got some ideas about using solar collectors to supplement the power supply for the light emitters. Looking at her excited expression, Ray realized that humans didn't just solve problems. They enjoyed solving them. Each obstacle was just another puzzle to unlock, each setback just a chance to try something new. For the first time since their sun began dying, Ray felt truly hopeful. His people had found not just a solution, but partners who could help them build something entirely new. Ray was reviewing construction progress reports when the emergency alert came through. His crystal form vibrated with shock as he read the message from home. Their sun had entered its final phase. The outer layers were already beginning to peel away, weeks ahead of their most pessimistic predictions. How bad? Dr. Miller asked, noting the change in his crystalline glow. She had learned to read the brightness's emotional states over the past months of working together. Critical, Ray answered, his voice resonating with worry. The young ones are already starting to fade. We have days, not weeks. He projected the latest images from his homeworld. The once brilliant crystal cities were now dim, their light barely visible against the darkening landscape. Dr. Miller immediately hit the emergency broadcast button. Within minutes, the station's main control room was packed with both humans and brightness. The images from Ray's homeworld played on the main screen, showing the deteriorating conditions. The first asteroid habitat is only 60% complete, one of the engineers reported. Life support systems are running, but we haven't finished installing all the light emitters. The commander's crystal form pulsed with distress. We can't evacuate millions of our people to an unfinished habitat. The risk is less than the risk of extinction. Dr. Miller cut in. She turned to the communications officer. Get me Earth Command. Now. What happened next showed Ray why humans had survived so many of their own crises. Within hours, space agencies worldwide had redirected every available ship toward the Brightness's solar system. Space stations were converted into temporary refugee centers. Private space companies offered their vessels and resources without hesitation. We can't save everyone at once, Dr. Miller explained, showing them the evacuation plan. But we can create a relay system. The strongest among your people will need to help shuttle the young and elderly using your own ships, while our vessels handle the rest. The commander looked at the logistics. Even with every ship we have, plus yours, we need to make multiple trips. The last groups will have significantly less light to sustain them, Ray finished quietly. They all knew what that meant. Some of the rescue ships would arrive too late. Then a message came in from Earth that changed everything. A video played showing thousands of people gathering in cities across the planet, carrying lights of all kinds. Dr. Miller explained that humans worldwide were donating their most powerful lights and energy sources to help create temporary shelters. We're stripping the light arrays from every stadium, concert venue, and greenhouse we can, she said. It won't be perfect, but it will keep your people alive until we can get them to the asteroid habitats. The evacuation began immediately. Human ships worked alongside Brightness vessels in a continuous stream. The space station became a coordination center, directing traffic and managing resources. Ray watched in amazement as humans worked without rest, many going days with only short naps and something they called energy drinks. When the power systems on some rescue ships started failing from the constant use, human engineers improvised repairs mid-flight. When a group of young Brightness began to fade during transport, the humans rerouted power from their own life support systems to strengthen the light supply. Why would they risk their own lives for us? The commander asked Ray, watching as another human ship departed with a full load of refugees. Because that's who they are, Ray replied, understanding now what he had learned from their historical records. They see someone in trouble, and they help. It's that simple for them. As the last light of their sun flickered, the rescue operation reached its peak. Human ships flew dangerous close to the dying star, pushing their shields to the limit as they picked up the final groups of refugees. Not a single ship turned back. Not a single crew hesitated. Looking at the determination on the faces of the human rescue teams, Ray realized that his people had found something far more valuable than just a new home. They had found a species that treated the impossible as simply another problem to solve, and strangers in need as friends they hadn't met yet. The orbital stations around Earth had never been so crowded. Crystal beings filled every available space, their dim forms creating a gentle light show against the metal walls. Ray moved among them, checking on the youngest ones who needed the most care. The humans had converted every suitable space into temporary shelters, each equipped with the special light emitters that kept the Brightness alive. We've got the third asteroid habitat online, Dr. Miller reported during the morning briefing. Her face showed exhaustion, but her eyes still held their determined spark. The crystal growing chambers are ready. We can start moving the first groups today. The commander, who had once doubted human capabilities, now worked seamlessly with the Earth teams. Our engineers have adapted the transport ships with the new light systems, he reported. We can move about 10,000 per trip. Ray watched the massive screens showing their new homes. The asteroids no longer looked like lifeless rocks floating in space. Humans had transformed them into glowing spheres, their hollowed interiors lined with crystal-growing surfaces and networks of light emitters. They weren't as natural as their old crystal cities, but they were going to be home. First group is ready for transport. a human coordinator announced. Ray observed as the evacuation ships began their careful dance through space. Each vessel was packed with brightness citizens, their crystal forms dim but stable thanks to the emergency lighting systems. Not everything went smoothly. During one transport, a ship's main power grid failed, threatening thousands of brightness passengers who needed constant light to survive. Ray watched in amazement as the human crew, instead of abandoning the mission, rigged their spacesuits' power systems into a makeshift energy network to keep the light emitters running. The suits will only last 6 hours, the ship's captain had radioed. But that's enough time to reach the habitat. We'll manage. When one of the crystal-growing chambers in the second asteroid showed signs of instability, human engineers didn't hesitate. They went in wearing protective suits, manually adjusting the crystal matrices while exposed to light levels that would have burned human skin without protection. "You're hurting yourselves to help us," Ray said to Dr. Miller after seeing the engineers return with light burns despite their protective gear. She shrugged, applying a healing cream to her own reddened skin. "A few burns are nothing compared to losing an entire species. Besides, we're learning so much from this. These crystal-growing techniques might help us build better solar collectors in the future." The migration continued day after night. Ray noticed how the humans adapted their schedules to work in shifts, always ensuring someone was available to help. They seemed to draw energy from each small success, celebrating every group that successfully settled into their new homes. Even Earth's children got involved. Schools organized light drives, collecting high-powered lamps and batteries to help power the temporary shelters. Messages of support poured in from around the globe, many accompanied by pictures of lights left on at night in solidarity with the brightness. "Your people's kindness is overwhelming," the commander said during one quiet moment, watching another transport ship dock successfully with the first asteroid habitat. Dr. Miller smiled tiredly. "This is humanity at its best. When we see others in need, most of us want to help. It's just who we are." Ray recorded everything in his crystal memory. The human crews working until exhaustion, then getting up to do it again. The engineers constantly improving the habitat designs, making them better with each iteration. The doctors who learned to treat crystal fatigue in the brightness, developing new techniques through careful observation and endless patience. As the last transport ship of the day departed the station, Ray looked out at Earth glowing below them. Their own sun was now just a dim spark in the distance, but here, surrounded by artificial light and human determination, his people were finding new ways to shine. The Great Migration was far from over, but with each successful transport, with each new group of brightness settling into their asteroid homes, Ray knew they had made the right choice in trusting these remarkable organic beings who turned impossible dreams into reality. One Earth year after the Great Migration began, Ray stood in the central chamber of the largest asteroid habitat, now named New Dawn. The space that had once been bare rock now sparkled with crystal formations growing in elegant patterns. Light emitters, carefully placed to mimic the spectrum of their lost sun, created an environment that felt remarkably like home. "The latest growth rates are even better than we predicted," Dr. Miller said, checking readings on her tablet. She had become a permanent resident on New Dawn, leading the human scientific team that continued to refine and improve the habitats. The crystal matrices are adapting to the artificial light sources perfectly. Ray watched a group of young brightness playing in a newly formed crystal garden. Their forms glowed brightly, showing none of the dimness that had afflicted their generation during the crisis. They had never known their original sun, but here in this human-made home, they were thriving. "The Council of Light is ready to make their announcement," the commander said, approaching Ray and Dr. Miller. His crystal form shimmered with what Ray now recognized as pride. They'd moved to the Grand Assembly Hall, where both brightness and humans gathered for the ceremony. The First Light, who had led their people through their darkest time, took the central position. "1 year ago, we faced extinction." Her voice resonated through the chamber. "Our sun was dying, and with it, our hope. We were a species bound by tradition, convinced that our way of life could only exist under specific natural conditions. She paused, her crystal form glowing brightly. We were wrong. The assembly watched as she activated a holographic display showing all 3 asteroid habitats, now home to millions of the brightness. Each one glowed with its own unique pattern of light and crystal formations. Humanity not only saved us from extinction, she continued, they taught us that adaptation is not weakness, that change can lead to growth, and that the impossible becomes possible when you dare to think differently. Dr. Miller shifted uncomfortably at the praise, but Ray noticed her proud smile. The first light wasn't finished. Therefore, today we announce 2 historic decisions. First, we are establishing a permanent scientific exchange program with Earth. Our knowledge of crystal growth combined with human innovation has potential we've only begun to explore. Excited murmurs filled the chamber. Ray remembered how human scientists had already adapted some brightness crystal technology to improve solar panel efficiency on Earth. Second, the first light's glow intensified. We are opening our habitats as waypoints for human space exploration. Our ability to grow and shape crystal structures, combined with human engineering, can help create sustainable stations for humanity's journey to the stars. The announcement was met with thunderous applause from the humans and bright pulses of light from the brightness. Ray watched as members of both species immediately began discussing possibilities, their earlier differences forgotten in their shared excitement for the future. Later, standing in an observation dome, Ray and Dr. Miller watched Earth shine in the distance. "Did you ever think it would work out this well?" she asked, making notes about a new crystal formation pattern she'd noticed. Ray shifted his crystal form thoughtfully. "I hoped we would survive," he admitted, "but I never imagined we would thrive like this. My people spent generations fearing change, seeing only threats and difference. We needed humanity to show us that differences could be strengths. And we needed you to remind us of what we're capable of when we work together." Dr. Miller replied, "Every breakthrough we've made here is already helping us build better colonies on Mars." A group of human children on a school visit passed by, pointing excitedly at the crystal growths, while a young brightness gave them a tour. They showed no fear or hesitation with each other, just natural curiosity and friendship. Looking at them, Ray realized that their rescue hadn't just saved his species, it had made both species better. In finding a new home among the asteroids, the brightness had also found a new way of living, one that embraced change and possibility. Their sun might have died, but here, surrounded by human-made light and human-inspired hope, the brightness had never shone brighter.